It is traditional to light candles in the memory of the millions and millions of souls lost during the Shoah. On Yom HaShoah in 1952, at the Yiddish Volksschule in Johannesburg, South Africa, the room is dark. Black curtains cover the windows. The mood is very somber. The door opens and in walks a 10-year-old little girl, Frida, my mother. She's holding a little candelabra, and the limited light in the room bounces off her golden curls as she walks to the front of the room. Frida chose this painful job. She struck a match and lit the 6 candles in memory of the 6 million plus Jews brutally murdered in the Shoah. She knew that she had to light those candles for the memories of her family she never knew. And she carried the sorrow of her parents as she did this very important job. This little girl made such an impression on the poet Yosef Peppernickel that he wrote a poem about her as she lit the candles. On the day of mourning for the 6 million, when our people uncovers its still raw wounds, Frida took her own 6 candles and lit them as an adult would. In Tag von Treue noch die 6 Millionen, wenn's Volk deckt ob die nicht verheilige Wunden, hat Frida, wie's wollte Größe das getan, genommen und allein 6 Lichterlachs angezündet. Peppernickel and Frida's father Yudel talked until the early hours of the morning. They only went to sleep at 4 a.m. Yosef Peppernickel then published the poem in his book, Over Ruins, all poems about the Shoah. My mother's grandparents, Yoshua and Riva Shriver, were last seen alive in the Vilna ghetto. My mother's uncle David and aunt Essia tried to escape to Lida, 65 miles away. They hoped to make a better life for themselves. Unfortunately, they were shot alongside 30,000 other innocents. The brutal mass murder of people we loved left a deep tear in the fabric of Jewish society. The pain remained raw and unhealed for generations to follow. My grandfather Yudel and grandmother Chava had named their daughter Frida. She was born in 1942. They named her Frida, peace. It was their hope that peace would come soon. The same girl who 10 years later, in 1952, would light the candles at the Yiddish Volksschule in Johannesburg, South Africa. My grandparents couldn't follow the usual Ashkenazi tradition of naming their child after those who had died. They had no idea who had lived and who had died during this horrific genocide. But after the war, it was discovered that their only daughter, Frida, her name incorporates all the members of my grandfather Yudel's family who perished in the Holocaust. Frida, peace. Frida, familia, family. Riva, Yoshua, David, Esia, Frida. My mother Frida felt the torment of her parents' memories. Living in a society filled with post-traumatic stress disorder and survivor guilt, I felt the searing pain through my Boba Chava and her daughter Frida, my mother. When my mother was 16, she was again invited to a Shoah commemoration, where she recited a poem for the community. And she lit the candles in memory of those lost, as she had done 6 years before. Years later, when I was 16, I stood at the Holocaust Memorial in West Park Cemetery in Johannesburg. And there, I recited a poem in Yiddish, just like that little girl Frida, my mother, did all those years ago. It was for the memory of those lost and for the pain of those left behind. It also stands as a weight of memory passing from one generation to the next. The poem I recited was by Abraham Stutzlaker, and he wrote the poem in the Vilna ghetto, where my great-grandparents were. When I read the poem, a Wogenschicht, a wagon of shoes, knowing the Yiddish made the poem much more poignant to me. Once, through a cobblestone ghetto street, clattered a wagon of shoes, still warm from recent feet, a terrifying gift from the exterminators. My determination to never forget was reinforced when I recited Switzger's poem, which he wrote in the Vilna ghetto on July the 30th, 1943. I wonder, were my great-grandparents Riva and Yoshua still alive then? In 2009, the little girl Frida, now a grandmother, stood at the same memorial at West Park Cemetery in Johannesburg, South Africa. This time, Frida's granddaughter, my niece, Daniela, had her turn to honor her grandmother's grandparents, who vanished without a trace. She stood there just like I did, and just as her grandmother, a little girl all those years ago. It was her turn to honor the other members of our family, whose faith we all knew too well, and the other millions of souls we do not know. And she recited in Tog fun Troia, a day of mourning. It was the poem written about her grandmother Frida all those years ago. I am going to tell the poem in Yiddish. The community I grew up in wanted us to speak Yiddish. They always said, speak Yiddish, that way Hitler will not have won. And so I will honor them by doing that. Many people listening will probably not understand the Yiddish words. However, I believe the feelings will override the will override the Yiddish. And of course, I will read an English translation of the poem. In Tag von Troja, noch die 6 Millionen, wenn's wohl deckt ob die nicht verheilte Wunden, hat Friedele, wie's wollte Größe das getan, genommen und allein 6 Lichterlach angezündet. Wie sie brennen, wie sie flammen, wie sie zucken, wie sie zittern und zappeln, wie von Pachat. Friedela ist mitten Troja sich missjachat. Steht sie stumm, also in Ehrgeiz wo vertrunken. Sie wollt wellen etwas fragen, etwas sorgen, nur wie mit a Heitele, a Feichele, bezeugen, reden scheuen bei ihr die große kluge Augen. Guckt sie, guckt wie ihre Lichterlach sie wären, was einmal als kleine gehen, sind Tränen. Wie sie wollten auch sehr Gold zählen, mit die 6 Millionen und Friedele nimmt zählen. 1 Million, a zweiter, zweit schon euch der dritte, 4, schon 5 und Friedele sitzt zu a Zitter. So hat der folgende verzeugen ihr Gesichtel. Sie ist ihr ausgegangen, schon das 6. Lichtel. In Tag von Troja, noch die 6 Millionen. In Tag, in ewigen Versar und Zorn, soll jedes Kind, wie's wollt es Friedele getan, 6 Lichtlach unsinden, die Kadoschen le Zikor. On the day of mourning by Yosef Papanikol, dedicated to Frida Shviro Neiman in Johannesburg, South Africa, and translated by Frida, the little girl who lit those candles. On the day of mourning for the 6 million, when our people uncovers its still raw wounds, Friedela took her own 6 candles and lit them as an adulthood. Lit them and stood gazing, how they burned and how they flickered, as if shivering in terror. Friedela united with them in her sorrow. Standing silent, thoughts elsewhere, wanting answers, standing mutely. Her wise, big, tear-stained eyes spoke for her, watching as her candles dwindled, growing smaller, ever smaller, going out in tears of mourning, sharing their fate with the 6 million. And Friedele began counting. 1 million, a second, the third now dying, 4 now, 5. Her face clouded, a shudder took her. The 6th candle now extinguished. On the day of mourning for the 6 million, the eternal day of anguish and sorrow, every child should do as she did, light 6 candles in sacred memory of our martyrs. My Boba Chavashvero never missed arranging a memorial every year. Even after she retired from being a lifelong Yiddish teacher. We, as a family, say Kaddish many times a year for our family. Kaddish. The prayer we say as we honor loved ones who now no longer walk on this earth, but whose memory lives on within our hearts, our minds, and our souls. We say Kaddish many times. We don't know the date they were murdered. We say Kaddish on the termination day of the Vilna Gittel, on Yom HaShoah, on the day of the massacre of Leora. We need closure. My mother, Frida, is almost 80 now. And she has the right to know what happened to the family. And the clock is ticking. The last memorial service my Boba conducted was when she was in her 90s at the senior facility where she lived. That was only 5 months before she passed in 2003. I have the obligation to never let the memories of those we have lost fade into obscurity. It's for my children and for the generations that follow them. This story is for them. And this story is for you. From generation to generation. Leora by door.